Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me, as almost every week I have with me, Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks, Jay. It's great to be with you again.
Always good to have you. Always good to get an update from an independent source in terms of what's going on around the world, and especially we continue to remain focused on the Ukraine because I think the Ukraine is one of the most important spots in the world now. There's certainly a lot of things going on all over the place, but the Ukraine, some have talked about it being very significant. In fact, some people have said it is potentially as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't know that people feel that way right at this moment, but what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the U.S. feels invincible, and the population has been completely dumbed down by mainstream propaganda. You know that, and never mind misreporting about what's happening there.
Hmm.
The U.S. mainstream. I read the Washington Post every morning, give myself ideas.
Hmm.
It's simply the Post and papers like it simply ignore the other side. They don't even bother to seek a comment.
Yeah.
They'll do a whole thing about one side, and then you won't say, Foreign Secretary Lavrov said, on the other hand, dot, dot, dot.
Yeah.
They've abandoned all pretense. It's just pure, straight ahead, like a locomotive propaganda.
Right.
So the Americans are convinced that their government is doing the absolute right thing. There's no danger of World War III. They know exactly what they're doing. But let's look around at their track record over the past 15 years at least.
Oh, yeah. Our foreign policy has been abysmal unless your desire is to destroy the United States and destroy the things that the United States has held precious, the Constitution, the ideas of liberty and freedom. I mean, if your objective is to destroy those things, then I'd say that the United States policy has been exactly successful. But if what you want, if foreign policy is supposed to protect the interests of the United States as expressed in the Constitution, I think it's been an abysmal failure.
Sure. And even if you're a humanitarian interventionist and you believe that we should use our power to make things better for people overseas and relieve them from the strains of living under authoritarianism, even by that measure, which you and I disagree with,
Yeah.
it's been an absolute disaster. I mean, how many of us are vacationing in Libya this summer?
Exactly right. And I did see an article somewhere on the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity talking about how the people that really die in these conflicts are not usually American, are not usually our fighting men and women, but basically the civilians that are killed in these countries too. So all this notion that we're going to do something good for other countries is just, I think complete hogwash. But let's focus a little bit on the Ukraine right now. There was an election last weekend, I believe it was, or was it the weekend before?
On
Was
the 11th,
on the
yes.
11th, and two areas of the Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, two jurisdictions voted, I guess, overwhelmingly to separate from the Ukraine, and of course. The will of the people there was completely ignored by our United States government. We decided that we weren't going to pay any attention to that. But now, you wrote an article, White House flip-flop, voting now crucial in the Ukraine. Our government is now all of a sudden saying, yeah, but there's another election that does count, the one that the two provinces held last weekend doesn't matter, but the one that's coming up now is very important, and that one will count. Talk to us a little bit about the flip-flop. What's going on there?
Sure. Well, I mean, the hypocrisy, I hate to use the term over and over again. The hypocrisy is so choking, it's hard to catch a breath.
Yeah.
The U.S. says that all it's supported all along in Ukraine is for the people to have a voice. The people need to have a voice.
Yeah, right.
And if you remember back from November of last year until February when there was the coup, it was just the people on the street fighting for their voice. And so, of course, the people who are not in the street don't count. They don't have a voice.
Yeah.
So when the people in the East who didn't agree with the overthrow of the government that was backed by the U.S. in February, the people in the East said, hold on, this is not the government we voted for.
Right.
So we don't agree with it. We're going to hold our own vote, and we're going to have to declare independence from this government in Kiev. And so they held their own vote. Obviously, it was not held under the best circumstances. they had the Ukrainian military that had attacked several towns in the middle of the vote and shot several people dead. And of course, on the side of the people holding the referendum, it's not the greatest situation to hold a vote in.
Mm-mm.
However, the U.S. immediately said this vote doesn't count. These people voting, it means absolutely nothing. It's not even a referendum. It's a joke. But I've seen the pictures, and a lot of people have seen the pictures of people lined up for blocks and blocks and blocks, just waiting to vote, waiting to express their view. And even if it was not organized perfectly with Swiss precision, how is it that the State Department can discount the will of all of those people who
Right.
peacefully were voting,
Right.
yet takes into consideration the people in Kiev in February who were violently throwing gasoline bombs at police officers,
Mm-hmm.
shooting people? How do they count more than people standing in line quietly to register their vote?
Yeah, and of course, our propaganda here, when those elections were going on, was implying in the United States that the people that in fact it was the Russian influence there that was keeping away the pro-Ukraine or the pro-NATO, pro-West forces away from the polls, right?
Well, what's funny? Sorry to interrupt you, Jay, but
Yeah.
what's funny is if you look at the voting pattern for that part of Ukraine, 90% of them voted for Yanukovych, the
Mm-hmm.
guy who was overthrown by the U.S.-backed coup.
Sure.
So the fact that 70 or 80% of them voted to break away should be no surprise. It's not rocket science.
Yeah.
Percent of
Yeah.
them voted for the guy that the U.S. helped kick out of office.
Yeah.
Of course, they're going to be irritated, as would we be irritated.
Yeah.
If a foreign country helped depose the person who we voted for.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting because I think also there was something about forcing the people or making the official language English instead of Russian. Wasn't there something like that going on there
Yeah,
too?
well, that was one of the first things. The Ukrainian West
Uh-huh.
passed a law saying that Russian was no longer a co-equal language, and they did reverse it, but the damage had been done. They sort of showed their hand a little bit too much.
Mm-hmm.
But the flip-flop that I wrote about, which is interesting, is after saying that this vote in the East, which we saw went along fairly peacefully, after saying this was total trash, don't even think about it, the U.S. is now spending a ton of money putting out YouTube videos and tweeting like mad, saying how important it is for Ukraine to go vote on the 25th. Because that's the vote that the U.S. wants to take place.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, if that's the Ukraine vote, I suppose those two eastern provinces would be voting in that one as well, right?
Well, they've decided to boycott that vote because they don't consider themselves part of Ukraine anymore.
Okay.
And of course, that is also thanks to U.S. policy because the country did not need to break up.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. kept pushing and EU, to be fair, kept pushing and pushing these people, not taking their concerns into consideration to the point they said, "We've had it. We're going to break away. We're out of here."
Mm-hmm. So the Ukraine's going to hold their votes without the pro-Russian contingent, or at least that part of it. I'm sure there are people within the other parts of Ukraine that are also of that opinion, that are also pro-Russian, I suppose. But I can't see how. I mean, the deck is basically stacked then in favor of a pro-NATO outcome, I would imagine.
Oh, sure, and I'm sure it's already gotten a blessing. I'm sure the report has already been written on what a wonderful vote it was.
Right.
But it's also hypocritical that the U.S. says the vote in the East is illegal because it's unconstitutional.
Right.
Whereas the government in Kiev was put into power in an unconstitutional manner.
Right.
And by nature, then it is illegal. So any action taken by an illegal government is itself illegal. So this vote itself is illegal according to the Ukrainian constitution. So the U.S. wants to tout the rule of law, except when it goes against what they want in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And it's just so transparently hypocritical.
And so childish. It reminds me of the time when I had three younger brothers, and we would get into spats when we were young boys, before we were 10 years of age, and we'd have our little fights and how we would all want to have it our way, and we didn't care about what was fair. And so it reminds me of Hillary Clinton say, we want democracy in Northern Africa, but we want our kind of democracy, meaning we want democracies that think like we do, and we won't let those people be free to be who they are and their values and so forth. What about, so we're in the Ukraine. We're involved there. Our NGOs, as you pointed out. Uh, it just seems like wherever we go, we make a mess of things. From what I can see, NATO. You wrote another article. NATO aims to repeat the Libyan, and you put in quote success in the Ukraine. Now we know success. What kind of success have we had in Libya?
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, I think this in some ways is the big story of the week, and I'm rather surprised it's not getting more attention. But toward the end of the last week, a former Libyan general called Haftar, who had been in exile in Fairfax, Virginia for quite a number of years, where it was rumored, it's been strongly rumored, and he has not denied it, that he has close ties to the CIA. He returned to Libya just before the U.S. attack on Libya, and he launched a coup attempt a number of months ago. But now, this past Friday, he got together with some people and started using helicopter ships to bomb parts of Benghazi. And as of yesterday, he and this militia that includes some of the Libyan military actually attacked the Libyan parliament, which was an elected parliament, not very cleanly, but an elected parliament. And now which many people consider him sort of the CIA's guy in Libya, now he's bombing the Libyan parliament and saying that this elected body is out of power and this other body that he prefers is now in power. So it's an absolute disaster, and it echoes quite a bit of what we saw in Egypt, where the U.S. helped overthrow Mubarak, and then decided, gosh, we don't like the guys that took over because they're Islamist. So they, of course, had been supporting General Sisi for the longest time, and he simply had a coup and threw out the Islamists in Egypt. So you see the same thing happening in Libya, really. The revolution consuming its own in a way.
Yeah. So that's what we're hoping to do in the Ukraine. It seems like wherever we go, where there's some kind of order, we stir it up and create chaos. And I have to wonder what's the purpose of that, Daniel?
I mean, maybe they want chaos. The big news in Ukraine last week that everyone in the administration was embarrassed about was that the vice president's son was named to the board of directors of the largest petroleum company in Ukraine. So, along with the person who had been John Kerry's top advisor in his presidential run back a number of years ago. These two very, very well-connected Americans, extremely well-connected Americans, are now set to ride atop the biggest oil and petrochemical company in Ukraine.
Oh, wow.
So that is a big deal, and that's what it's all about. I mean, it's just blatant.
Blatant crony capitalism, using American military force and American clandestine CIA, NGO operatives to line the pockets of politically well-connected people.
Sure, and they're gonna play with the oligarchs in Ukraine who are willing to play ball, and everyone is going to make a ton of money. And sadly enough, the same people who suffered in Ukraine, the same people, and there are plenty of them who did get into the streets in Kiev and did protest in an honest way because they were tired of the oligarchs stealing everything in sight. These same people are also being double-crossed because the oligarchs are back in charge, and they're now dealing very closely with the American oligarchs and probably even some of the Russian oligarchs.
Another article you wrote, why won't Kerry leave Syria alone? Talk to us about that.
Well, there was another meeting this past week of the horrifically ill-named Friends of Syria group. And I once wrote a piece called "With Friends Like Friends of Syria." ...
Yeah.
Oh,
who needs enemies?
Pardon me. Exactly. So they met and decided that they really need to ramp up assistance to the opposition, the rebels in Syria. Assad has been gaining the upper hand in many areas, and so the U.S. took the unprecedented turn a couple of weeks ago to start sending these very deadly TOW missiles to the so-called moderate opposition. And as I pointed out in the article, they immediately ended up in the hands of the extremist Islamist fighters, as could be expected by anyone who's watching it closely. But Kerry also took the opportunity. It didn't get much play, I think, because it was so absurd, but to make yet another claim that that President Assad is using more chemical weapons. He said the raw data has has shown that they've been using more chemical weapons. Of course,
Oh,
that was his claim last summer that was
sure.
totally debunked by people like Seymour Hersh, who found out it was something very, very different. It was a false flag attack by Turkey trying to get the U.S. to get involved in Syria. So here's Kerry saying, yes, some raw data suggests that there was a chemical attack. And then meanwhile, Defense Secretary Hagel on the same day said, we've not seen any evidence of additional chemical attacks. You know, as we wrote in the piece, I quoted the Moon of Alabama blog saying it seems like the administration's at war with itself even.
Yeah. Well, more and more chaos.
But you know
Explain why. Go ahead, Daniel.
I was just going to say what's interesting though, and I tried to point out in the article that there has emerged, no thanks to the U.S. and wonderful democracies like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, right?
Yeah, right.
Our great allies. But despite their efforts, there actually has been an indigenous sort of light at the end of the tunnel. The Assad government and the rebels in Homs, which is known as the birthplace of the revolution, the birthplace of the fight against Assad, they reached a peaceful agreement whereby the Assad government would allow the rebel fighters to leave the city unharmed, go somewhere else. It came off without a hitch, really. And what miraculous thing happened, I've seen so many pictures of it, it's very heartwarming. The people who had abandoned Homs, who had fled Homs, who had been refugees, they're streaming back in droves. I saw a picture today of a bunch of people with wheelbarrows trying to repair the local church. So the people are coming back. And as I wrote, if the U.S. propaganda about Assad had been right, that all he wants to do is kill his own people, he would have taken that opportunity to bomb all these people coming back.
Right.
You know, but there is a kernel of hope in these kinds of agreements. And Aleppo is the other big battleground right now. And there was an interesting article in Al Monitor, a paper in the Middle East, where all of the fighters in Aleppo are completely tired of this. They're weary,
Sure.
looking for a way out. And so
Sure.
Homs could be the model for peace, but the U.S. won't have it.
We don't want peace.
More missiles, more missiles. They can't back down and say, you know what, we probably got this one wrong.
If you could just leave the people alone, they'd probably find a peaceful solution
absolutely
to it. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, explain to me, Daniel, again, help refresh my memory here. Why would Turkey want to see the United States come in against the Assad regime?
Well, very early on, Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan had abandoned his foreign policy of no bad relations with neighbors and decided to sign on board to the overthrow of the Syrian government. And so he started off, he was one of the early conduits for U.S. transshipment of weapons. And really a lot of people speculate, and I would certainly buy onto it, that Turkey was a transshipment point for Libyan weapons that ended up in Syria, shipped out from Benghazi. And it was probably a dispute over the shipment of these weapons that led to the attack on Benghazi that killed the ambassador. Of course, neither Republicans nor Democrats want to even explore that possibility because they all agree with the U.S. attack on Libya. They all think it's great.
Yeah.
You know, they just want to score political points. So Hillary's a monster because she covered it up, and other Republicans are doing this and that.
Right.
But that really had a lot to do with it. So Turkey has been involved in this from the very beginning. They're neck deep in it. The Turkish government, the Turkish people don't want to deal with it at all. They're having to absorb a lot of refugees. They don't want to have the spillover. And the last thing they want is to have these radicalized jihadist fighters who are already starting to go back home to places like Jordan and even to Western Europe. The last thing they want is an influx of these extremely radical and extremely violent people. Who would want them home? You know?
Yeah. Who well, I don't know. It just doesn't make any sense. But I try to put this together, Daniel, and try to make some sense of it. And I just have a hard time doing it unless the aim of somebody is to create chaos in the world and to gain power and control that way, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how I wonder how John Kerry can stay in office. He seems to me to be unhinged. I mean, he really does. I don't know
Yeah.
how else to explain it. He seems unhinged.
Yeah. So why won't Kerry leave Syria alone? What's the answer to that question in your headline?
They can't back down. They're
Yeah.
convinced that they're right. They're
Yeah.
convinced that we're the chosen nation, and
Yeah.
we have to guide everyone else into their own new freedom,
Right.
no matter how many of them we have to kill.
And as you say, the Washington Post, these papers that are supposed to be the New York Times and others, aren't really willing to aren't willing to challenge the establishment and the political system anymore, are they?
With very few exceptions, and those exceptions then just get ignored. We talked, I think, last time about this New York Times crew that went into eastern Ukraine and discovered that actually there aren't any Russians in here. They're all Ukrainians who are ticked off over the coup in Kiev.
Yeah.
And they reported it in an article, and a lot of people with our non-interventionist perspective repeated it, but it didn't get any legs in the U.S. mainstream media, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, it's the neocons that seem to be in charge in both parties to a great extent, and Walter Jones, notwithstanding, he's we one of the few brave people who are willing to stand up for and to think independently, Daniel,
Absolutely, one of the best.
and really a great guy. I mean, Ron Paul was there. Are there any other congressmen that deserve some credit that you can
Well,
think of?
sadly, the group that was around Dr. Paul at the time, they're sort of slowly going by the wayside. But I
Yeah.
would say certainly John Duncan of Tennessee
Yeah.
who is a very conservative guy. But he also is conservative enough to realize that war is not conservative. It's the opposite. It's revolutionary
Yeah.
on the other end of the scale. So I think he's certainly one of them. And I think certainly there's great promise from Justin Amash, a young member who has always been very friendly to us and always friendly to Dr. Paul. But they're as good as these guys are. Everyone is always whenever everyone said we need 500 Ron Pauls, but in 200 years we've only produced one. They're the
Yeah.
exception that proves the rule in a way that the solution is not going to come down from on high,
Yeah.
Capitol Hill. The solution is not to elect a couple more good people.
Yeah.
The solution is to be absolutely unbending in our dedication to the truth and do our darndest to educate people, because people yearn for the truth. They yearn to understand these things, and I think that's where change will come from, and that's what Dr. Paul has always been dedicated to.
Well, that's certainly what you're dedicated to, Daniel. I know you very well, and I know that you stick by principles. And otherwise, you wouldn't be sticking to what you're doing. You probably could make more money doing a lot of other things. But in any event, I want to thank you once again for coming on and talking to us. I think you're absolutely right. The change has to come from the bottom up, not from the top down. The top down has its interest to protect, and it wants to keep things the way they are. And revolutions come from the bottom up, the ones that last anyway, and
Yes.
that are worthwhile. Well, thank you very much, Daniel, again for being with us. It's the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. People, folks, listeners, go there and read the numerous articles that are posted there. Some things from David Stockman, a lot of different people, a lot of great people that are attached to the Institute for Peace and Prosperity that contribute there. Thank you very much, Daniel, for being with us once again.
Thank you, Jay.